Well, welcome back to the shop. We're in for another brief overview of how to assemble an ARF. I am your host, Joshua Orchard. We are going to be continuing our work on the T-Storm Edge 540 from Ohio Motor Products. And if you are interested in this airplane, there is a link in the description if you want to check it out. I'm looking forward to flying this airplane soon, but we've got to finish assembling it. So let's get started. All right, guys, so I'm going to first go over just a couple of things that I've got out on my workbench, just some tools and supplies, some basic things that you'll need. So today we are focusing on the tail. We're just going to be focusing on the tail so that it's a little bit more digestible and you can see some of the small tips and tricks along the way. All right, so let's get into this. So again, we have our epoxy. We've got a little tiny mixing cup. These are like little medicine cups. You can pick these up off of Amazon. I think it was like 10 bucks for a pack of 100. I've got a whole stack of them down there. I use bamboo skewer to do mixing in the mixing cup. Sharp blade for cutting. 3-in-1 oil, which you'll see why I need that for. I've got my drill, of course. For making little holes that I'm going to be needing. So obviously I need my drill bit set. And Goo Gone. Goo Gone is going to be used. So anytime that a supplier comes with this tape, any kind of tape really, I remove this tape very carefully. But even when you do, there's a little bit of residue left over just from the tape, and so I use some of the Goo Gone on a paper towel to remove that. This is actually really nice that OMP includes this style of a servo connector here, that this clips into the servo connection of the servo, which I have over here. Now, if these clips are not included, I also use shrink tube, like electrical shrink tube, to go over the connection to keep the connection together. You can also use electric tape. I've seen that too. I've also seen people use thread that you sort of thread it through the wires and wrap it around the connectors and then use like a drop of CA or two. Either way, you're trying to just keep that connection together without like hardwiring, soldering it together in the event that there is a servo failure. So that's really what we're going for here. So what's really nice about this ARF is that the surfaces that are pre-hinged are already glued. But unfortunately, what that means for you is you don't see my tips and tricks about how I manage hinges on ARFs. So you do get to see that a little bit today, which I'm going to go over on the rudder. These are pin hinges, so they're handled a little bit differently than like the CA hinges you might otherwise see. So generally speaking, for those, I actually use wood glue like Tight Bond 2, just because I have a little bit more working time and I can wipe away. I don't prefer to use the CA glues, mostly because they can fog up the covering, and I hate the way that looks. They can wick in pretty easily if you use real thin CA, but I like to make sure that the glue really gets in there. So maybe another time I can cover that in a little bit more detail, but all I'm working with on this airplane are these pin hinges. They're like Robart style pin hinges. So we'll go over that. Otherwise, push rods are push rods, whether they're short push rods like these or long push rods where the servo is up further in the fuselage as opposed to in the aft end of the fuselage. Push rods are push rods, and you just got to manage the connections and get the geometry right. But other than that, the kit comes with the hardware that's pretty well labeled. Hardware is for a 60-inch edge elevator. So there are these. Don't forget, we also have left over from the other kit. I got to go get those in the box. But the servo arms, the fiberglass servo arms that go on the servos with the wheel disc. So we're taking some of those things that we learned from the first video and we're applying them to the second. And we're just gonna do a little bit more progression and we're gonna get the tail end of this assembled and it's gonna be great. We're looking forward to flying this. Let's get started. All right, so a couple of things that I want to go over here is in this plane, there is a tube that has the servo extensions already inside it. Now, because of my servos, I think this servo extension is not very long. In fact, that's where it comes out. So I'm going to have to do my own servo extension there. Only needs like just a couple of inches. I think I have one in my drawer, so I'll go digging. If not, I'll just make one. I highly encourage you to get a set of servo connectors and a proper crimp tool. Also, servo wire, because it's just cheaper and it's a good skill to have. The connections do go bad over time. I've had servo extensions that I've purchased that have failed. So yeah, it enables you to make your own extensions and make repairs. So invest in one of those. So there's that. And then the next thing I want to go over is the servos. So upon installation of the servos, I should note that there was a little notch in the fuselage, and that's sort of like indicating where the servo sort of hooks in. Servos in the tail usually should be oriented with the wires heading forward anyway. So anyway, I didn't really know which way, like whether this was going to be the elevator or rudder servo. So when I did this one first, I had set it up pointing down. And then as I did this one, I realized, oh yeah, that's definitely going to be the rudder, because if this points up, it's going to be hitting the horizontal stabilizer. Whereas this one pointing up is right along with the base of the horizontal stabilizer. So this is definitely the elevator servo, which I do have a little bit of lead for. And this is the rudder servo, which I do not. All right, so before moving on, the next thing to do is we're gonna mix up some epoxy. And in this particular case, this sucker just slides. Ooh, that's upside down. Always make sure you've got the right side up, because I have glued them on upside down before. Okay, it's embarrassing when you show up to the field and you've glued your horizontal stabilizer upside down, because you can't fix it unless you start over again. So everything here like is self-jigging, which is super nice. It's super easy. But the trick that I usually use when gluing these, and if you don't have the jigging type, or if it doesn't have like its own set of screws to locate things, always take measurements. Okay, so take like a single measurement up here. Like here, I wouldn't necessarily go directly from this point to the back, or this point to the back. I would try to do like something in the middle. Like I would take a measurement here, because you don't necessarily know that this is square. Sometimes there's a thrust angle on this firewall mark. So just try to make sure that you've got some sort of center line that you can use as a reference, and then you can measure from that center line to the tip of the horizontal stabilizer. I don't necessarily go from the elevator, because in this case, the elevator moves, and so because of that movement, you can have an error in your measurement. I use just a measuring tape. This is for garment construction. You know, back when people used to make their own clothes. You can pick them up at a craft store. They're pretty inexpensive. If not, you can try using a ruler or even just a string, and then you can like mark with a marker on the string, and that'll work too. But yeah, that you want it to be equal, an equal length on each side. But since this jigs together, I'm just going to smear some epoxy and then stick it in there, let it cure. While I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead, and once that is in place, this goes in behind it. And then it's the same principle as last time. I'm going to use some isopropyl alcohol on a paper towel, wipe up the excess epoxy while the epoxy is still wet. That way everything looks nice. There's no overflow. It doesn't look horrible. Everything looks clean and nice, and everything's going to be secure. Again, I'm going to be using 5-minute epoxy on this, mostly because everything keys together anyway. There is clearly some carbon fiber, or what looks like carbon fiber material, that helps to make this elevator sturdy. So I'm not too terribly worried about the glue letting go. I think I'll have a structural failure before I have a glue failure in this point. So again, if you feel so inclined, you can use 15 or 30-minute epoxy. That's your prerogative. It will hold stronger for sure if you use the longer cure times. But I again have found that 5-minute epoxy works just fine. So after that, then we'll move on to do some hinging, and let's just knock out this epoxy real quick, and we'll come back. Just so you guys know, I usually mix my epoxy for like 30 seconds, like a solid. I just count 30 seconds in my head, just to make sure that it's thoroughly mixed, and I'm scraping the sides too to make sure the two parts are mixed together. It's not fun when it doesn't properly mix and you have a totally horrible mess to clean up. So make sure it's mixed before you start using it. All right, so we are gonna take a little break here. Look, I'm gonna let this cure out for at least an hour. Make sure it's nice and solid before I start working on anything. I did take a couple of pins just to pin it in position. There's a plywood plate down below, so the pin isn't going into it. And I'm pretty sure I hit a hole on this side. But anyway, it's roughly pinned just for location purposes. It still kind of wiggles around, but that's okay. That's okay. I just need it to be held in position while the epoxy is curing out. A whole bunch of gobbing out, but that's fine. That's the whole reason why we do epoxy all over. I'm going to make sure that this doesn't spill over, and just set that up against like that. And when I come back, I'm going to use this as my test piece to make sure that the epoxy is cure. and solid before I test the piece. Okay, you do that one. You do that one first, because if you haven't thoroughly mixed it all the way, it's going to take either a really long time or you have to start all over. And that way, you know, you use the test bowl as your litmus test, as it were. All right, so I am going to go take a break and we'll be back. All right, so what have I gone over and why? So first thing that I want to make sure is perfectly clear is I did check the epoxy when I came back. Tried pulling the stick out and it cracked, so nice and hard. And I pulled out the remaining stuff in the cup and just reused the cup. So on top of that, off camera, I also was able to locate the, let's come around here. I was able to locate this slot for the rudder control horn. It was not cut like any of the other ones. So the ailerons were cut, and I did find one in the elevator that was cut as well. So I had to open that up. And then of course the control horns, I roughed up the tab that goes inside before epoxying that in. I've got, it clears to the max. I checked that before. And also when I epoxied this in, that is to the max as well. So those are all good. So with that, I moved on to the hinges. So the hinges, what's critical about those is lubrication. So in order to prevent the epoxy from seeping into the cracks of the hinges, I used 1 drop of the oil. I've seen people use different types of oils. There's like Teflon based lubes. You can use that. I've seen people try to use lithium grease, like the spray on lithium grease. I don't feel like the lithium grease penetrates as well. I've also seen people keep a spoon of Vaseline in the shop, like a metal spoon of Vaseline, and then they heat it up and then dip the hinge into the Vaseline. Like it's like at a 90-degree bend, and they dip it into the Vaseline, and that works great too. I've done that before, but I find that just a simple drop of 3-in-1 oil is sufficient, especially if you're cleaning along the way. So after I had epoxied the control horns in and lubed and had pre-lubed everything, by the time I was putting in the rudder into the fuselage, the epoxy was already starting to set. Like my work time was basically done. So that's something to keep in mind, that you've got to work and you've got to think ahead. So anyway, I think it's fine. I was able to clean up any residual epoxy before it was fully set as well. So I think it's going to look just great. I think it's going to hold great. And so I'm going to take another little break and let those joints all harden out before I move on to the final hardware for the servos. All right, and we're done. We're done for today. Let's cover what I've done and just do a final recap. So I did add a little servo extension down in there, just 4 inches or so, should be plenty, and used my servo tester to keep them center. I used my little clamp to hold them center. whether it was the rudder or the elevator. That just works really well, and it's great for just keeping things mechanically centered and perfect. I will say that the hardware included is really nice. I love ball links for my connectors, and it takes out a lot of slop from the controls. It's really, really nice. For the elevator rod off camera, I did end up shortening that metal rod by about 5 millimeters. That way I would have adjustability in and out. As it was, like with both of the ball clevises tightened in all the way, I was still off about 5 millimeters. So I cut that off and then cut a little bit more off again so that I have some screw in play for adjustment in the future should I need it. But it's still got plenty of thread engagement on that control rod. But yeah, man, it's looking real sharp. Real sharp. So next time, guys, we are going to be back in the shop on the fuselage again, because obviously that's all there is, because I've already done the wings. But we're going to get going on the landing gear. So that's pretty straightforward. On this airplane, it's all bolt-on stuff, but again, there's some small tips and tricks along the way. You're going to want to stay tuned and be caught up for that. So until next time, keep on building and keep on trying to keep flying those flying works of art.